guys, and welcome to chapter 2 of Miraculous Ladybug fanfic, A Complicated Romance. I actually just recorded the first bit without even making the introduction, like I forgot. I was like, oh no. But anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you do, then be sure to leave a like, even leave a comment if you like, and subscribe. Anyway, let's get on with it.
Dear Princess,
Adrian Agrest, the 22-year-old regretful model, wrote. No, he thought. This was a serious matter. He simply couldn't afford to mess around with nicknames. Adrian sighed as he aggressively crumpled up the bit of paper and hastily threw it, aiming for the bin, but of course he missed. Ugh, Adrian groaned before dragging himself out of his chair and making his way over to the crumpled bit of paper. He sighed as he picked it up.
Adrian, I love you,
Marinette said happily as she held her hands in his. Adrian had cried after she'd said that. He never believed that someone would ever truly love him. Of course he was famous and likely had many women that were crazy for him. But they were all just obsessed fans, and most people he somewhat knew would just want him purely for his money and family status, which Adrian didn't wish to be a part of, and not who he really was. At least, not the parts of Adrian that truly mattered and made him human like any other. Marinette squeezed his hand gently, hoping he would open up. He sniffled before smiling at her.
I haven't heard that in years,
he admitted shyly. Marinette looked confused.
Heard what in years?
She questioned. Adrian frowned as he lowered away his gaze.
Well, my father, he's not said that phrase to me in years.
Adrian stuttered sadly, peering at his feet with embarrassment. Marinette frowned and her face became concerned.
Oh, Adrian,
she cooed sadly as she pulled him in for a hug. Adrian was slightly stunned, but he gladly accepted her comforting embrace. Marinette softly pressed her lips to his cheek before whispering into his blonde locks.
Well, I love you, Adrian, and I always will.
Tears rolled down Adrian's cheeks at the once beautiful memory.
And I will always love you, my Marinette,
he whispered to himself sadly as he wiped away his tears. He then remembered another loving moment between them. It had been a day, a terrible one at that. Adrian had just had a pretty rough night due to his father's usual antics, and when Adrian finally gained the courage to leave, he had stormed off out into the cold night. And all of a sudden, Adrian found himself outside of Marinette's bakery. It was as if his heart knew where he needed to be, where it was best for him to be with her, the love of his life. Marinette had still been living with her parents while she was attending art school, as she hadn't had the money for her own place, and also because she wanted to help out with her parents' work as much as possible while she continued her studies. Her parents of course paid their daughter for her work, much to her own hesitation, but it still wasn't enough for Marinette to live alone. He was stood out there as it rained, watching the harsh droplets as they'd pelted against the bakery, covering the windows in what looked like teardrops. Adrian allowed himself to breathe in the freezing wet air that surrounded him, when all of a sudden Sabine had came to the bakery door and was in shock at seeing her daughter's boyfriend soaking and standing out in the pouring rain. She was horrified at the sight and quickly ushered the boy inside and guided him to the comfort of the living room sofa. She then made him a big cup of warm tea with the side of passion fruit macaroons. She knew that they were Adrian's favourite because Marinette had told both her and her father back in high school. Adrian thanked Sabine. He was grateful for her loving hospitality. The way she treated him had reminded him of his mother, his sweet and gentle mother. Sabine felt very much like a mother figure for Adrian, but at the same time, he had felt guilty for feeling that way. After all, his own mother was dead. His own mother shouldn't be compared to any other woman. That was what Gabriel, his father, had shouted about to Adrian any time he had mentioned the feeling of a mother-like figure. He had once confided in Natalie, of whom opened her arms for the fragile boy. Later on, Adrian had confessed this to his father out by his mother's statue. He said that he loved Natalie and felt that his father should be happy again, and even mentioning that his mother would agree to it, not wanting the pair of them to wallow their lives away in a grief which was so deep and so consuming. Sabine smiled and was about to join him, but then Marinette came running down the stairs to ask her mama something when she spotted her boyfriend looking gloomy and soaking wet in the family lounge. Marinette immediately ran over to his side and joined him on the couch.
Adrian, are you alright?
She asked with a concerned look. Marinette truly cared for the boy, and Adrian could see that, and it gave him a bit of comfort to know that someone cared about him, especially since it was someone as caring as Marinette.
I've just had a rough day. That's all, princess,
he said as he smiled at her. Oh, but Marinette was too stubborn to fall for it.
Please, what happened? You can tell me, my love,
she said sweetly as she grabbed his hand gently and nuzzled against his shoulder. Adrian couldn't say no to her. She was too stubborn and too adorable, and he loved her for it.
Well, you see, my father, he wants me to model with someone that I don't want to have anything to do with,
he said frustratingly as he sighed. He had wondered if Marinette was becoming bored of Adrian's constant complaining and constant miseries, usually concerning his father. It did often make him a little insecure, wondering if his sadness and his moments of depression were tiring out his girlfriend and her patience. Marinette frowned. She was disappointed, but not surprised in the least. It was just like Gabriel aggressed to make his son uncomfortable and not care to take responsibility for the feelings that would flow from it.
I'm sorry, my love. Would you like me to try to reason with him?
Marinette asked soothingly. She had to admit she was a bit fearful of the man. After all, he practically owned the world of fashion and could easily perish Marinette and her beloved designs from within it. But when someone would dare to upset the love of Marinette's life, she herself became just as scary, and nothing else mattered in that moment. She absolutely couldn't bear to see her dear sweet Adrian in pain because of his cold and careless father. Adrian's insecurities faded as he smiled at her. He really was grateful to have someone like Marinette in his life. No, Adrian was grateful that the person he had within his life was in fact Marinette de Pencheng. He honestly didn't know what he'd do without her.
No, darling. I don't want my father to have a reason to try and split us apart,
Adrian said as he continued to smile lovingly at the girl. Marinette again frowned.
But Adrian, he can't really do that.
Adrian looked down at her, trying to hide the slight fear to be seen within his face.
Well, I just don't want to chance anything. It's really okay, princess. I'm just glad that I have you,
he said as he lightly pecked her cheek affectionately. It was true. Adrian could never be more grateful in his life for anything. Marinette was simply his favourite and most treasured person, and he knew that without her, he'd be lost. Without Marinette's kind encouragement, Adrian would still be a completely miserable mess. Marinette blushed at his touch. When it came to Adrian Agreste, everything always managed to fluster her. To Adrian's surprise, Marinette then pecked him on the lips.
Of course, my love. You will always have me because I love you.
Adrian beamed as a blush also appeared across his cheeks.
I love you too, my princess,
he replied as his eyes glistened with a passionate love. Adrian then wrapped both of his arms around the girl, his girl, and gently moved her towards his chest. As he did so, he took in her passion fruit macaroon-filled scent. Adrian had wanted to stay in that position forever, just cuddled up to the love of his life without any other care in the world. But alas, nothing really lasts forever. He now knew that cold truth more than anyone. Adrian adored his memories with her, but they were too painful to relive. His green eyes glossed as he held back his tears. How he wished he could get her back. How he wished that the disgusting manipulation had never taken place. Adrian tried to get his mind back on track, but failed as he remembered the one thing he wanted to remove from his mind the most. He unfortunately remembered the absolutely distraught look on his princess's face. The time he had first broken up with her, unwillingly, of course, as Adrian. He also remembered the lies he had spilled, as well as the fact that he absolutely could not bear to look Marinette in the eyes. He couldn't even lift his eyes off the ground, because if he had, then she would have seen that Adrian was silently sobbing. Tears rolled down his cheeks, but it was dark and stormy, so Marinette didn't pick up on it as easily, but if not for the weather and the heaviness of her own feelings, she definitely would have noticed. After all, Marinette is an art student, and she could and would pick up on any detail. Adrian sighed. He really wanted to forget his first breakup. It was still haunting him over 2 years later. The manipulation hadn't stopped either, so there wasn't much that Adrian could do.
Marinette, my love, it's too complicated for us to be together. I can't see you anymore.
The blonde had regretfully remembered saying. He pictured the look on his princess's face as if it had taken place just yesterday. She was obviously confused and thought he was just messing around with her, but nonetheless, she had fear, a whole lot of fear displaying within her glimmering bluebell eyes.
We cannot be together. I'm sorry, my love.
Adrian had repeated to her, only a lot more coldly this time around. He had felt as though tiny daggers were stabbing away at his heart as he saw her once love-filled eyes, instead illuming with hurt and despair. He could still remember the desperation in her voice, in her eyes, and it hurt him more than any physical wounds ever would. The fact that he had ever hurt his Marinette gave him feelings of guilt, sadness, and pure pain.
How could you say that, Adrian? Things are complicated. Since when? I thought you loved me. I thought we had something special. Something that was worth waiting for.
Marinette said as she choked whilst fighting the tears as they took over, while Adrian was unwillingly reliving this moment of their past. He wished he had at least thought to give her closure, even if it was a false one. At least then, Marinette would have been able to move on without having to suffer as much. Not having to wonder why such a seemingly perfect relationship had suddenly crashed, stealing away her oxygen with it. It had taken everything within Adrian's soul to hold in his pain, to hold back his overflowing form of tears within his eyes. He never allowed his eyes to leave the floor. He couldn't let Marinette see. He couldn't, because if she saw, she would have known that this wasn't what Adrian had wanted for them. And then she would have begged and absolutely begged him for the truth, the explanation, and Adrian couldn't refuse her. It's why he had to ignore her pleas of sadness, much to the breakage of his own heart. It's why he had to stare down at the dampened concrete, and why he could not look into her gorgeous eyes as she cried, as she wept, and as she choked out all of her emotions, not managing to contain any of them. It was as though her walls had just crashed down along with the relationship. Adrian came out of his thoughts only to find himself sobbing hard. Adrian didn't like to cry. He didn't like to see or hear it. To Adrian, him crying was proof that he had broken Marinette's heart and completely ruined any form of trust between them. He hated his manipulator. He wanted to cataclysm them, but knew that it just wasn't possible. He sniffled sadly. Plag flew over to his kid. His tiny cat-like ears drooped at the sight of Adrian in pain. Plag felt awful for his companion and desperately wanted to help. Despite Plag's selfish facade, he was actually a caring and kind creature. Yes, he loved Camembert, but even that wasn't as important to him as Adrian. He flew over to his friend, hugging into his neck sympathetically.
Thanks, Plag.
Adrian whispered as his voice cracked from his fading tears.
Listen, kid, why don't you try to talk to her?
Plag suggested. Adrian again wiped his eyes. He then looked at his friend sadly.
Because, Plag, the manipulation I was placed under, I can't do anything, no matter how bad I want to, no matter how much I wish I could hold her, kiss her, and apologize 1,000,000 times to her. I just can't.
Adrian cried out coldly. The hurt was radiating within his voice.
But Adrian, it's been over 2 years since they manipulated you. What if it's all over now?
Black said. Adrian sighed.
I don't know, Plague. I really don't want to risk anything. Unless...
Adrian perked up slightly at the end of his sentence. Black's eyes grew wide with curiosity.
What is it, kid?
Thank you so much for listening to this chapter. I hope that you enjoyed it. And apologies if my voice sounds a bit croaky. I think there's something wrong with my throat, but it's fine. Because this happens quite often, which I don't really understand why, but I still, do things anyway. But anyways, goodbye, and I'll see you in chapter 3, which I don't know when it's coming out, because it's not written just yet, but I'll make sure to write it soon.